Okay, today's shir is sponsored by Zecher Nishmas Aaron Tzvi ben Yosef and Sanal Menachem Zal, B'Sham Shev and Aliyah. Okay, we're going to move along in our Kasher Shmuz, and I want to talk about Shechita a little bit. Now, Shechita has been under attack from Al Zaytin a lot of different times. It's been attacked from the outside. It's been attacked from the inside. It's caused tremendous rifts in communities and fights. For example, one of the earliest main fights between Hasidim and the Misnagdim all over Ukraine was about Shechita. In New York City in 1900, it was about Shechita. When the Radvaz went to Chicago and got death threats, it was about Shechita. There's been many fights worth discussing in regards to Shechita. And I want to start with one that involves a tragic and conflicted character who was involved in one of the most monumental Shechita bans in the history of Judaism. So I'll start with his Levaya and we'll work our way back. In 1966, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the yeshiva of, I'm not going to pronounce the cities right, of Montreux, Switzerland, a small yeshiva, was brought to Eretz Yisrael for his Levaya in 1966. He died. He was brought to Eretz Yisrael for his Levaya. And the plot that the people who were being Mesader found for him was a plot in the brand new cemetery in Sanhedria, where they were going to put him in a chalka and start a chalka zerabanim over there. On his way, by his Levaya, an old friend of his, by the name of Rabbi Chaskel Sarna, the Yeshiva of Hebron, gathered a few of his bachrim together, and he said, do me a favor, go, when they're ready to take him to the Beis Olam, just steal the casket and drive him directly to my plot on Har HaMenuchos, bury him in my spot in the Chalkas Rabbanim on Har HaMenuchos, and they're not going to dig him up once he's buried. And Kachaver, Rav Chaskel Sarna's Talmidim, waited till the end of the Levaya, they staged an intervention, they grabbed the body of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, and they took him and buried him in Rav Chaskel Sarna's plot in the Chalkas Rabbanim and Har HaMenuchos, and Rav Chaskel Sarna, who died several years later, had to get a new plot. Now, I saw a writer comment on the story that this story describes the essence of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg's life. This is the type of life he had, being tugged from both sides. Everyone thought he was theirs, but not really theirs. He's being tugged. So Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, let's just give a little background. He was a Polish boy, a tremendous Eloi, who, as a young man, went to learn in Slobodka by the altar. He was a contemporary of Reb Aaron and Reb Yaakov and Reb Ruderman and Reb Chaskel Sarna, a close Talmud of Moshe Mordechai Epstein, a real Eloi. As a matter of fact, he became a Rav in a small Litvish town at, I think, 22 years old while he was still single. And Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky said that in his experience, nobody became a Rav in Lita unless they knew every Prima Gadol in Yeridea. So he was talking about a Bacher in Yeshiva who, before he was married, at 22, knew every Prima Gadol in Yeridea, by l'chayra objective standards. So he becomes a Rav there. Eventually, around World War I, he has kind of a falling out with the yeshiva system, and he starts going to college. And there's a story of the Chafetz Chaim trying to convince him not to, but he wants to proceed with it, and he ultimately becomes a doctor. He becomes a rabbi doctor. He graduates college. He develops a strong relationship with Rabbi Soloveitchik while they were both in school together in Berlin. He becomes more of a modern figure. Then in his 30s, he gets hired to become the Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva Academy of Berlin. Now, the Yeshiva Academy of Berlin was a yeshiva that was founded by Israel Hildesheimer, who was a Talmud of the Aruch LaNer, a close friend of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and then it got passed on to Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, and then to Rav Avram Eliyahu Kaplan, and then they brought in this young rising star, the Sri Deyesh, to be the Rosh Yeshiva, and he's the Rosh Yeshiva who ends up having to shepherd this yeshiva through the period of the Nazis till it's closed down. I think the yeshiva officially, ceased being a yeshiva on Kristallnacht in 1938 is when the yeshiva ceased operations. So he's the yeshiva who gets the as a young man, meaning as a man in his 40s maybe, a genius, a former product of the Lithuanian yeshiva system, then became a graduate of colleges, was a very, very well versed in all different chachmas, and he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva who has to fear the yeshiva through this war. Now, why is he relevant to Shechita? Because in 1933, the Nazis made an outright ban against Shechita. One of the first anti-Jewish laws that they banned was they banned Shechita. They said Shechita is not allowed. Now, they didn't come straight at it and say, Shechita, Jewish people can't do Shechita. What they said was, in order to protect the feelings and the rights of animals who are put through tremendous stress and pain by the Shechita process, so they had two takanos that they had to make. By birds, they felt that the most efficient way to kill a bird and not have it suffer is to completely sever the head. The halacha in Hilchos Shechita is that we don't completely sever the head. We sever just the kana and the veshet, just the trachea and the esophagus, and then you leave the spine connected. You don't sever the spine. So they said, birds, you have to sever the spine. Okay, problem number one. And for animals, for gases, for big animals, they said they wanted to institute something called himum, where you have to shock it with a strong bolt of electricity, a strong shock of electricity, so that it loses its faculties. It's totally not aware of its surroundings anymore. And then once it's shocked, then you could do the shechita. Now, both of these things created major problems in halacha. Now, the one who set about trying to see if there's a way to make this all shtim, see if there's a way to make this all work, was the Sri Dayesh. He was the one, from the community most impacted. He was the Yeshiva of Berlin. He was most impacted. He was the one who had deep relationships with all the Gedolim throughout Lita and Poland, he had swam in all those circles. He kept the relationship? Yeah. He had swam in all those circles. He had relationships with all those people. So he was the one who was given the task to try to see if there's a way to make this all work, if there's a way to make the shtim with halacha or not. Now, just right off the bat, he already had a handicap, and I'll explain why. In 1933, just a few months earlier, he had gone to the Munkatcher Rebbe. We spoke about this chasana once. The Munkatcher Rebbe made a chasana for his only daughter in 1933, and the Sri Dayesh was close with the Munkatcher, as different as they were, and he had gone to the wedding over there, and while he was there, he gave an interview to the local Yiddish paper, the Yiddish Zeitung, I think it was called, in 1933, where there was a movement pushing boycotts against German products. Jews in Poland and Lita and Ukraine were saying, let's boycott the Nazis because they seem to be anti-Semitic. They had the rhetoric of the Nazi party, very anti-Semitic. Let's boycott them. And he came there and he gave an interview to this paper, the Yiddish Zeitung in Munkach, and then he followed it up with another interview to a paper in Varshat, another Yiddish paper, saying that the German rabbinate's position is that the Nazis are not so bad. Really all they're doing is they're trying to fight against the communists. And yeah, their rhetoric is a little harsh, but you have to just understand where they're coming from. They're fighting in a system where this type of rhetoric is necessary. And if you ban them and make a boycott, then you're going to push them over the edge, and then they're going to become anti-Semitic. So don't just hold off a little bit, and it won't be so terrible. Then, literally a few months later, comes the first batch of the Nuremberg laws. Amongst them, the outlawing of Shechita. And everyone sees, schwarz auf weiß, that no, the Nazis are not playing around. They didn't really know what it meant to not play around, but the Nazis weren't playing around. They meant what they were saying, and all the rhetoric of anti-Semitism and etc. was real. And Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg lost a lot of, let's just say a lot of street cred. Meaning, everyone was like, hey, you don't really have what's going on. So then, in 1933, when he was the one who was chosen by the committee to salvage Shechita in Germany, to reach out to all the Rabbanim and to make tumult and to try to see what could be done, right away the first trip that he made to Vilna, I think, to meet Rav Chaim Ozer to discuss it, as soon as people became aware that he was in town, every newspaper in town said, oh, the sympathizer's back. The sympathizer's back. They tell us again how to deal with the Nazis. And ad kadei kach that he had to cancel his trip to Varsha. He had planned to go from Vilna to Varsha, to go to like the seat of power in the Litvish world, and then the seat of rabbinic power in the Chassidish world, and meet the Gedolei Rabbanim and discuss it face to face. And right away, as soon as people became aware, they're like, no, thank you, this guy's back to tell us about, So he was starting off on the wrong foot right away when he was trying to defend Shechita. So ultimately, he writes letters to all these Gedolei Rabbanim, and he compiles a vast array of different tshuvas, letters from Sai German Rabbanim and Sai Litvisha and Chassidish Rabbanim. And at the time, he had tried to lean towards Kula, and I'll explain we'll get to the halachic shilas in a second. He had tried to lean towards Kula, but the Gedolim, meaning of Chaim Ozer Be'ikr, strongly said that he didn't want Kula. Ad kadei kach, Chaim Ozer was brilliant at managing these type of things, asked him for the equivalent of being CC'd on every email. He said, any letter you write, please ask them they should send a copy to Chaim Ozer Grzinski in Vilna and to Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg in Berlin. Like that, he was part of every conversation. He didn't want to be... Don't have any conversation where you say something, someone says something, and I'm not aware of it. Like Chaim Ozer, and it's written in... Yechiel Yaakov writes this. Chaim Ozer has to be CC'd on every email. So Chaim Ozer managed this crisis, very hands-on, and Tzimsaif, his weight on the scale, shut down any chance of a kula happening. But I want to read a little bit of the Sri Dayesh's, call it tortured writings on the topic, meaning he's writing in a terrible time from a terrible place. And the Sri Dayesh, this wasn't published at that time in the 1930s, and ultimately no kula was made, and in 1938 everything went sideways anyhow, and the rest of the story we all know. Later on, years later, when the Sri Desh went to Switzerland, then he compiled his Mechtavim, then he shared some of this story with the public. So now, I'll read some of it, and he writes as follows. Before we just go into his Hakdama, I just want to, let's do his Hakdama first. So he says as follows. He writes, the Pesach Shar Sefer, he says, I'm spreading my hands to Shemayim to say thank you that I was saved from Germany, Eretz Hadamim, Umeir Berlin, from the city of Berlin, that was turned in those days to be the capital of Rishus in the whole world, he says. Then he says, for obvious reasons, Karasi es Ashmaya, I called the name of my Sefer Sri Deyesh, embers, remnants of a fire, Sri Deyesh ki Kishmoy Kein Hu, Srid Zoyer, a tiny, shard, an ember, Me'asref Hashem Hashem Esir Harisha HaChavlanis V'Haratzchanias. A tiny shard of remnant that stayed over from what Hashem was Seirif in Germany and all of Europe, during those years. He says, I wrote many, many more, much, much more than this I had written and stored, but it was all burnt and ruined and lost. He says that a tiny chavile ksavim, a small packet of ksavim that I sent with my Talmud before Kristallnacht, I got out of Germany, and in it was this batch of ksavim about this sugya. And he says, and although at the time Rav Chaim Oizer told me that it was not the proper time to publish it, because Rav Chaim Oizer didn't want, he says, and even though I never was going to actually be makel halacha l'maisa on my own, I was always looking to the Gedolei Hadar to decide yes or no, but my conscience was noiter l'tzad kula. It was leaning in the direction that a kula is possible, and Rav Chaim Oizer felt that was the wrong message to convey. So in the time, this was not published. I didn't share this with anybody. But now that this is all said and done, and we're writing in the 1950s, I feel like it's finally time to share this tragic story with everybody and what went on and what the back and forth was. And he writes, I'm going to share this with everybody, and he's going to publish it. Now, he rather writes like in here about the yeshiva and how much he enjoyed the yeshiva and the godless of Israel Hildesheimer and the godless of David Tzvi Hoffman and Aleph Kaplan, Rav Eliyahu Abba Kaplan, who was the yeshiva before him, who died. He died at 34 years old. It was a tragic story. Another Litvish yeshiva product who was brought. He died at 34. Shaka Chama, exactly. He made up a famous poem, a song, Shaka Chama. It's still sung today, somewhat, So exactly, that was that. Sadly, all we know about him is Shaka Chama. Maybe they'll find a campaign for his Yom Nesilim. Maybe they'll make a campaign for his Yom Nesilim. But right now, all we know is Shaka Chama. So he writes about this yeshiva that he loved, that he cherished, that he took such good care of, and how it was all ripped and torn out from underneath him. The Sri Desh had no children. He never took another serious stellar in his life. He was offered many times to go be a yeshiva here, a yeshiva there. He stayed in a small yeshiva in Montreux that was like basically for working guys. He was sad. He was very sad. And you see that come through very strongly in what he's writing about the story. Now let's get to what the actual halachic question was. I'm not going to get lost in the weeds here because it's a very much a weeds type of sugya. But let's just say what the inyanim are. So there are 6 concerns. First of all, like this, let's start backwards. Chicken, to cut off the head of the chickens all the way, is less relevant because chicken was not so popular back then. Back then, beef was what people ate. Beef was cheap and available. Chicken was a rich man's food. Just strange. Chicken was a rich man's food. Chicken was something that not everyone had. Chicken became a food for everybody in the 50s and 60s later on, when they mass-produced chicken farms or whatever, which probably involved a solid amount of tzar b'l'chaim on its own. So chickens were not popular. They were for rich people. And cutting off the head after Shechita is a minor problem. It's a chumrah. The Ramah himself writes that it's a chumrah not to do it. It's not really puzzle. There's much more wiggle room there, and the Sri Desh was able to get many Rabbanim to sign on with him to say that would not be, kazeh shayla chamura. That's not such a big deal. But the beef question about stunning the animal with a bolt of electricity before you shecht it, that was much, much more of a shayla chamura. And there's 6 halachic, problems that could arise from it that the Sri Desh talks about. He says, now the one who actually conducted, there was a lot of science of the day, scientific studies of the day that were conducted by a doctor. His name was, Dr. Shmuel Lieben of Prague University. He conducted many, many studies. He published them. He sent them to the different parliaments of all the governments in Europe. He was the one who compiled a lot of the science research that underpins the sugya. And the Srideish quotes from his scientific studies liberally, and everyone who writes on the topic quotes from Dr. Lieben's studies liberally. Now, the 6 problems that he says that he rises are as follows. There's a chash nefula. The din is that an animal that's nefula, an animal that fell from any height, we're chayshish that it got all sorts of internal damage, all sorts of internal bleeding or internal displacement of its organs, and therefore becomes a treifa. Now, that's not something you could ever test, because you can't see what the inside of an animal looks like until you kill it. So, chash number A is a chash nefula. The animal, when it's stunned, what happens is the minute the bolt of electricity hits its brain, it collapses like a pancake. So you're talking about an animal that could be 2,000 pounds, a big cow, that's standing, and then boom, it just drops to the ground in 1 second. So there's chash nefula. Now, normally nefula means falling from some height, meaning like you have to drop the cow off the table. That's nefula. To say that nefula means just the body weight of the cow itself falling is a shtickle chumrah. The Srideish works with that, and there's what to play around with. But chash number 1 is there's a chash nefula. There's a chash that becomes a treifa when it falls to the ground. Chash number 2 is that perhaps the bolt of electricity does damage to its actual brain. Meaning there's many treifas, not many. There's a treifa called nikav hakrum. It's one of the Mishnah on Eilu treifas. The third treifa that it brings down is nikav hakrum. If the membrane of the brain has a puncture, and the membrane of the brain is very thin and easy to puncture, and therefore it's possible that when you're shocking it with a bolt of electricity running through the brain, it's possible the krum of the brain could be punctured. And again, this is something that's very difficult to test because the skull protects the brain, and if you're going to tear off the skull, you're automatically going to damage the thin membrane that lies underneath it anyhow. So it's almost impossible to test, like post-op, was there a damage to the membrane of the brain, beforehand? Because the process to extract the brain is so damaging to the brain that you're not really going to be able to figure that out. So chash number 2. Then he says, there's a chash treifas bereya. There's a chash that maybe the lung could become punctured. And now this is one of the most relevant and prevalent chashas of tarfus that exist in beef today is sirchus on the reya. If there's like a hole in the reya that developed a scab, but the scab is not sufficient to bind itself with the lung, and therefore it's considered like there's a hole in the lung. So even though the animal could technically walk around and breathe and live because there is a scab, but the scab is really just like a Band-Aid. It's a temporary thing. It's propped up because of the cavity. It's there, and should the animal shift positions or the lung move out of positions, the scab could pop off, and then the animal is a treifa. So says the Srideish and Dr. Liebens, it's possible that when you shock the animal, the voltage and like the shock the animal receives could misalign, its internal cavities and create that the sirchus, these scabs that are covering different punctures in the lung, could be misplaced. And now in that instant, it became a treifa before you shachted it. That's chash number 3. Chash number 4 is that the blood could be absorbed in the ivarim. Now, this is one I don't fully understand the science of it, but there's something called havla stam, where if the animal is not bled properly, meaning in Shechita we bleed the animal properly, so much so that Dr. Liebman in his studies proved that I think by a large animal, 60% of the blood of the animal drains during the first 50 seconds after Shechita. Meaning the way Shechita renders the animal, 60% of all blood in the animal drains in those 50 seconds. And by a chicken, it's 80% of the blood that drains during that initial burst after the Shechita. Like Dr. Lieben in the German that the studies published talks about like the PSI, like a power hose. Like the PSI is a liter per 4 seconds, and there's mathematical calculations for that. And based on how many liters of blood an animal, it's science of the day that Dr. Lieben's engaged in. Now, there's something called havlas adam, where the blood is not being bled out properly, it's not being drained properly, and there's a chash that when you stun the animal, the process of the blood, shifting and moving out of the veins bursting and the blood moving starts already, and since there is no cut for the blood to drain from, it won't drain properly. And I think chash number 5 was when they checked the stomachs of animals that were stunned, they found like blood clots in the stomach. And they don't know Dr. Lieben could not explain exactly how that should transpire. But again, something of note that's not what a stomach usually looks like. The stomach looked different. And again, if the stomach presents differently, perhaps it's a treifa. Now, chash number 6, I think, is they found blood clots in the heart as well. Meaning the way somehow it stops the heart or could potentially stop the heart beating and therefore blood could clot up in there. They found blood clots in the heart as well. Now these 6 chashashis of tarfus, of the animal being a treifa, exist when the animal is stunned in this manner. And the Srideish spends hundreds, not an exaggeration, hundreds of pages batting back and forth these six chashashis back and forth with all the Gdei Rabbanim of his day. So A, I'm not going to get into the weeds, and B, I don't know if I even know the weeds. I mean, it's hundreds of pages of back and forth, but But these are the 6 chashas that happened, and he goes back and forth with all the Gedolei Rabbanim, and he is noite lahakol, let's say. He's not being mekel, but he's noite lahakol. And he writes this very clearly in his Akdama. He says, Aviyadati meirosh, he says, and this was, Stam, a side note, this was a tragic reality of Germany after Haskalah, meaning even after people like Rav Shamshon Nefal Hirsch and people like Rav Zeriel Hildesheim were able to be matzel Germany in some sense, but Germany did not have there's no nice way to say this, Germany didn't have the Gedolei Hadar. German yeshivas weren't producing the Gedolei Hadar anymore. For Gadol Hadar Shilas, they were off, they were calling the Gedolim in Litva, the Gedolim in Poland, the Gedolim in Russia. They weren't producing their own independent Gedolei Hadar on the caliber of the other segments of Yiddishkeit. So he says, I knew right away, the leaders of Haredi Jewry, I knew right away, there was no chance they'd be maskim to a heter that involves a substantive change to the mahalach that Shechita is done. Hanog bi Yisrael midar deris. Va'afani ba'atzmi, he says, libi nakfi ma'oid, l'geshes le'inyan zeh. I was very tortured, very troubled to come to this inyan. I knew it wasn't a simple matter to be makel on a Shechita that was going to be substantively different than Shechita has always been done. Shu yisoid ha-yisoid this b'chai Yisrael. Shechita is like a bedrock of Klal Yisrael and the food we eat. V'kama pamim amarti la'goyin etzadik Reb Ezra Monk, who was one of the leaders of the Save Shechita conference. It was Reb Ezra Monk, and it was Reb Meir Hildesheimer, and it was Reb Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, several Gedolei Rabbanim, and the Ksavim all exist. I mean, it's a mountain of Ksavim that they produced on the matter. He says, I expressed it many times that she'ein lanu l'chapesh eterim l'shinoi ofen hashchita. We can't really look for eterim for the shinoi ofen hashchita. And he continues, and then he says, L'maisa Tzum Seif, he says, Rav Chaim Ozer told me that there's nothing to talk about over here. Rav Chaim Ozer told me, I'm not maskim to make a shinoi in shchita. And this is interesting. Rav Chaim Ozer had a very, like a panoramic view. Rav Chaim Ozer looked at Klal Yisrael as a whole. He says, yes, gerecht, it's possible that in Germany right now, it's a morid k'shas adchak, and you have sick people and old people who need meat. And you're telling me that as ashas adchak, and there's makom lahakol, so make some shchita for them, and do it, and even if it's not in the best way, they could bet some meat treif if they need it, meaning they need the meat. So even if it's not the best way to do it, Rav Chaim Ozer said, I'm looking at this from a panoramic view. He says, and to be mekel in a shas adchak in one place and say, okay, you know what, we'll concede, shchita is a little bit barbaric, and you have a better method to kill animals, and there's people who are sick and ill and they need it, so let's do it. He says that undermines shchita for all Jews everywhere. It means implicit in that is that you're like, we're kilu maskim, yeah, shchita is really suboptimal, it's not great, and we'll have to come around. The Chaim Ozer said for us to take a position that says kilu, that we hold, we're maskim, that shchita is suboptimal, that undermines us as everything. That's terrible. That's kfira. I mean, we don't need anybody else's haskam, anybody else's agreement that this is the optimal way. He says Dr. Lieben is going to prove with all his science that shchita is taka, the premier method to kill animals, even from a tzar b'l'chaim perspective. We'll get into that in a minute. But we don't need that. That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to defend shchita and say, on your terms, we're maskim, we're not maskim, we agree. So Chaim Ozer felt that to be mekel in this shas adchak would undermine shchita for everybody, and therefore was a no-go. So Chaim Ozer was the one who ultimately shuts down any push to being mekel from these things, and he says not to go forward with it. Now the Sri Eish says that he was maskim, he agreed, he didn't publicize these contrasim to anybody because Chaim Ozer told him not to, but now, years later, he could do it. Now, with that in mind, and with that hakdama in mind, that we absolutely do not need to defend shchita from what others say. Shchita, according to the Gemara in Chulin, several times is a clear halach l'mishmei Sinai. All the dinim of shchita are halach l'mishmei Sinai. So this is not something that needs to be defended, and we don't have to prove that it stems with modern sensibilities of tzar b'l'chaim. But for a minute, let's go down that road. Dr. Liebens has what he has. He did many studies to prove that shchita does not hurt the animal doesn't feel anything. I want to read you 2 quotes from doctors from today. This is from an article the Star K put out, where there's one doctor, he's rather Jewish, the other one's not Jewish, which makes it even more interesting. This one's Dr. S.D. Rosen. He says as follows. I want to read this. I thought this was a very good way to say it. It says, characterization of shchita as cutting an animal's throat with descriptions of blood spurting from the neck or the late muscular spasms are unattractive to say the least. says when someone comes in and they describe Shechita in purely secular medical terms, Shechita seems and sounds extremely unpleasant, he says. However, to the uninitiated, coronary artery bypass surgery is also visually unappealing. He says watching someone have an open heart surgery is also very bloody, not geschmack to watch. It does not look nice. After a review of the psychological issues involved and the experimental data, it is submitted that Shechita is a painless and effective method by which to stun and dispatch an animal in one rapid act. He says, it might not look pretty, it's bloody, it's gory, it's messy, all true, so is surgery. He says, but that doesn't mean that scientifically it's not accomplishing the tasks of dispatching an animal and stunning it so that it doesn't know what's going on in one quick shot. Now, there's a second one that's even more interesting to me. There's a lady, a doctor. Her name is Dr. I should have it here somewhere. One second. Dr. It'll come to me in a second. She's like the main livestock consultant for the entire United States. She's like the ASPCA and the Humane Society. She's like an icon of animal rights in America. She's autistic. She's a wealthy girl who was autistic, who was raised with all the help she needed, and she was one of the original people who started equine therapy, livestock, horses, animals, as part of the therapy. She wrote a bunch of books on autism and a bunch of books on animal rights. And she's a guy from Montana, not Jewish. She conducted independent studies. Dr. Graydon, that's her name. Dr. Mary Graydon Temple, exactly. Mary Temple Graydon, that's her name. Dr. Mary Temple Graydon, that's her name, exactly. Autism. And she conducted studies where she writes as follows, that Shechita was she said, I was relieved and surprised to discover that the animals don't even feel the super sharp blade as it touches their skin. She conducted tests, and the wildlife said they don't even feel the blade. They made no attempt to pull away. This is from a study she published. And then it was in a scientific paper, and somebody published a rebuttal study against her, where they made new tests, and they showed that the animal did feel pain. And she published a rebuttal to the study, where she wrote as follows, and this is a guy writing this. She says, point number one, there's several flaws with your study. She says, point number one, during actual Shechita, the cut is held open, meaning the Gemara Chulin says you need be'inon Shechita meforas. You need a Shechita that leaves the cut open. A cut that lets it seal upon itself is a psul in Shechita. It's not, maybe not ma'akiv, it's not one of the 5 ikr psulim of Shechita, but the Gemara says many times be'inon Shechita meforas. So she says, during actual Shechita, the cut is held open and does not allow nerve endings to touch. The research paper did not note if this was done during the study. She says, B, the knife used in the study was only 9.65 centimeters, which is much shorter than the Shechet's Chalif. This is what she's writing in her words. Which is much shorter than the Shechet's Chalif, whose length is double the width of the animal's neck, thus ensuring a swift and smooth cut. She says, third, a Shechita knife is sharpened by hand on a whetstone and achieves a smoothness and sharpness unattainable by the mechanical sharpening devices used in the study. So Dr. Temple Graydon strongly defended the vitality of Shechita, and our Shechita is not what it seems. So these are modern day scientists, and Dr. Lieben wrote much of the same back in the day. And there's many studies. I printed out the psychological study. It's 7 pages long, full of medical terms to define how animals feel pain, when they feel pain, and etc. There's definitely a lot to be said that Shechita does not pain the animal. Of all methods that could be used to kill an animal, it's probably from the least painful methods to kill an animal. Now, I just want to say one more nakuda. I don't want to give credence to something that's a very far out there philosophy, but a bunch of years ago, there was someone in Eretz Yisrael, he was called Harav Nazir, Rav David Cohen, not Rav David Cohen from Chevron, Rav David Cohen, a different Rav David Cohen. He was one of the closest Talmidim of Rav Kook. He was the father-in-law of Rabbi Goren, and he was a Nazir. He grew his hair long, whatever. Now I don't know what the year was, he published a kuntras called Chazon HaTzamchanut VaHaShalom. It was the dream of vegetarianism and peace. And it was Le'ilu Nishmas, Rav Kook's grandson, who died as a young boy. And what it maintained to do was present Rav Kook's ideas of vegetarianism and how the world should be headed towards a vegetarian place. Now, I want to point out, A, we don't know of any Gedolim who were vegetarians. B, Rav Kook himself was not a vegetarian. So I think, I don't want to give too much credence to a far-out theory, but I just want to use it as a jumping-off point to just highlight a nakuda. So some of the rayas that he brings are basic famous things. L'mashal Chazal, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Mentes Amud Beis says that Adam Rishon was not allowed to eat meat. Meat was only allowed after Noach. So he says Adam Rishon was not allowed to eat meat because that was the idealized man. That was man in its perfect state. But man, when he became diminished, had to eat meat. Or there's a Gemara in Pesachim and Daf Mentes Amud Beis that says that an Am Haaretz is not allowed to eat meat. Why? Because you don't need it for anything important. What do you want to do? Go do Averis? You don't get to eat meat to fuel your body to do things that are not, that are not valuable, that are not important. It says, you see, meat is not ideal. It's like a hirasha. It's a thing, and he weaves, and it's a lot of it is very luftig and esoteric and not what you would call regular types of rayas. And I think it goes without saying, he tries to suggest, the Mashal, he brings the hiratzin that we say at the end of Shemar Nesrei. We say, hiratzin u'fanecha shivanu v'zmikts p'rei b'yemenu v'sham navad chuviyira v'arva l'Hashem minchas Yehuda v'Yerushalayim k'yishanim chadmayim yois. It says v'arva l'Hashem minchas Yehuda. Why does it say minchas? Why doesn't it say zivcha Yehuda? The karbanas of Yehuda. Why does it say minchas Yehuda? Mincha is made with flour and oil. It says could be lost lava. There's not going to be karbanas anymore. He brings a Rambam in Meir Nevuchim that the Rambam says that karbanas were given, to combat avodah zara. It's like this very interesting. Yeah, I don't want to say it. So I'm just sharing. I said I don't want to legitimize something that's like a very far out type of thing. I'm saying that clearly, but this is what he says. Now, Lamashal, the Rambam, to say that, the Rambam Mefurish in Perek Yud Aleph and Ilchos Malachim says Mashiach is going to come and he's going to bring back Malchus Yisrael and he's going to bring back the Beis Hamikdash and he's going to bring back karbanas. He says it very clearly. So the Rambam himself, from who you're drawing a raya, or for example, the Gemara in Tainus and the Gemara in Nazir says that Kol HaMitzayir Atzma is Nikra Chayta. Someone who withholds himself from eating and from drinking and from having what's available to him is called the Chayta. The Gemara in Bava Metzia on Daf Ayin Beis, Bava Kama, the Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Ayin Beis, for example, says Rav Nachman would never pass on a Shaila until he had meat. Because he wasn't ready. He couldn't do it. The Amshel Shleima and Chulin and Daf Pedal and Aleph brings down that even though the Gemara in Chulin seems to say one shouldn't eat meat too often, he says that's a financial concern. That's a Naftali Horowitz concern. It's not a halacha concern like you shouldn't have meat because meat's not good for you. You should have meat. Meat's important. It's a financial concern. Don't buy meat too often because meat's expensive. That's what the Amshel Shleima says. So I could rebut this 100 ways. Of course, that's not my point. But the point is that there was those who looked at, like, even from a Yiddish perspective, it's like, L'maisa, it's Sar B'Lachayim, and you're hurting the animal, and it's not the optimal situation. L'maisa, there's many Gemaras, there's many Chazals that clearly show that one is permitted, and even, allowed to, and even it's desired that he should, so that he should have the proper energy and nutrients that he needs to do his Avodas Hashem. Now, I just want to share, there's one thing, there's so much more to say about this, I'm not going to be able to finish it today, we're going to have to continue this, but I just thought this was interesting. Reb Tzaddik says, the pasuk that says about eating meat for the first time, pasuk in Devarim says, Ki sesava lechel basar. Ki sesava nafshecha lechel basar. When your nefesh will want to eat basar. Reb Tzaddik Shalzach says, Ki sesava is the lashon of taiva. Ki sesava. Says, nefesh, neshamas don't have taivas. Bodies have taivas. Nefesh is pure. Says, Ki sesava nafshecha. When your nefesh will have a taiva. He says, isn't that's a little bit incongruous. So says Reb Tzaddik, Ki sesava nafshecha is, he says, eating meat and eating things that keep you fueled up and charged, so you could daven, so you could learn, so you could do what you're supposed to do, chesed, do whatever the mitzvahs a yid is supposed to do, is a tavas ha-nefesh, he says. Kisesava nafshecha, that's not a taiva of the guf. The nefesh needs to be fueled. He says, kisesava nafshecha, it's a taiva of the nefesh. A person is supposed to eat well and be prepared. The Shach and Shulchan Aruch paskins that in general, by and large, it's asur to fast, unless you need to. The Mechaber in Hilchos Tainus brings a machlokes, but the Shach says, for regular people, not allowed. You can't do it because you're not going to have karchas. You're not going to have the energy that you need. Now, there's a story that I don't like at all. I just want to share, and we'll end with this. There's a story about a din Torah between the Bach and the Taz. Now, I personally don't like the story, but I'm told that the Chazon Ish used to say over the story to advise a certain bechin of Avas HaTorah, so I'm going to say it over. The Taz was the Bach was from the Gdei Adar in Poland. He was the Rav in Belz, where he was unceremoniously fired from. And he left Belz with some curses. 3 of them, he left Belz that their water should not be drinkable, their boots should always be muddy, and the crops should have a hard time growing there. And the Sar Shalom of Belz, the first Belzer Rebbe, used to speak about the klalos of the Bach when he left Belz, and how they were the Niskayim. Then he went to Brisk, he became a Rav in Litta, and he was he wrote a sefer on the Torah. The Bach is from a first ballot Hall of Famer. Now, he had a son-in-law, the Taz, who was another first ballot Hall of Famer, right? The Taz is also, an icon, a legend. And supposedly, as a young man, the Bach pledged Kes to the Taz. He pledged the Taz would get to eat in his house. And in the Tanai Ksuva, the Bach said, I'm going to feed you meat every day. And at some point, the Bach, who was not a rich man, started feeding him organ meat, like lung, liver, kidney, organ meat, which is much cheaper. It was just garbage. Nobody wanted it. It doesn't have the bite of muscle. Muscle is what meat's supposed to taste like. Organ meat is like soft and mushy. And he started getting that for cheaper and feeding it him. The Taz felt that his learning was suffering. He didn't have the same rikos, the same concentration. And he brought his shver the bach to the Torah. Now we have no documents of this. We don't know what the back and forth was. It's a legend. It's a story that says that the Taz, exactly. So the Taz brought his shver to the Torah, and they went back and forth about if lung meat and liver meat and kidney meat is considered, proper meat. All I was able to think of is there's a Gemara in Chulun and Daf Mevav Miralef that handles if rich people eat this type of meat or not, but I don't know what the back and forth would have been until finally the Bezdin came out and they paskin that the Bach is right, organ meat is called meat, and he's satisfying his chiyuvim. When he left the Bezdin, people came over to the house and said, this is like a little unseemly. It's like unsightly. You take your shver to the Torah because you're not getting the meat that you want. And he said, no. It was very simple. I realized that my rikuz is not the same, and I felt that there's a kitrug in Shemayim on the Bach that he pledged to give meat, and that's how I was able to learn, and now the meat's not coming forward, and I didn't want it to be a taina on the Bach. So I said, let me go to Bezdin, and I knew full well that Bezdin will paskin that he's right. There'll be a psak, that Bezdin said. This is in Kishem what do we say? Kishem through Retarim Bezdin Shamata, Kachim Retarim Bezdin Shamala. It's a psak. It's paskin in Bezdin that this is considered satisfying his obligation, and therefore he'll be fine. Now, I obviously don't like the story because I have a very hard time imagining this is not how I would imagine the Taz and the Bach. And I think even the Chavetz Chaim once said that if you think the Tzais enjoyed a piece of kugel, you're crazy. Chavetz Chaim was like, enjoy a piece of kugel, the Tzais couldn't enjoy a piece of kugel. So for me to think that the Taz and the Bach,
He said he enjoyed it. He said it.
Exactly. So I said, exactly. So my personal, I don't love the story, but the Maisa, I do know. It is said that the Chazon Ish used to say of the story to convey all these messages that you're saying, that it made him healthy and that it's important, and that's why I'm sharing it. It's the same. This is kisesav nafshecha. That's what I'm saying. What the Taz's Dintayra was, what Reb Tzaddik is saying. This is kisesav nafshecha. When a person eats and eats well, but it's kisesav nafshecha, that's the type of achila that the Torah is talking about, is being matter to do certain things. Now, there's a lot to continue about Shechita. I even want to do a little bit more on the Tzar B'Chaim element, which I'm not going to do now. We'll continue. But there's many more controversies. I want to get to the Chassidim. The Baal Tanya has many letters. Many of the Charamas against the Baal Tanya and the Rebbes of Trisk and Slonim and Stalin were about Shechita, and we'll get to them. And the first chief rabbi of New York probably died because of Shechita. So we'll get to all these things in Mitzvah Hashem. To be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.